figure like him is quite relevant for our, modern day sensibilities, in the sense that he was really an international character. I mean, he lived primarily in two different countries, both the UK and India. He was at home in both, spoke multiple languages, communicated with people all around the world, and was talking about economic inequalities. The idea of the drain of wealth that he's developed is much more robust. He's talking now about, anywhere as, up to 25% of the revenue of British India being siphoned away through one mechanism or another. And he importantly links the drain to the need for political change. The drain of wealth is being caused because British people are running the country and we're paying for their salaries. And they are taking their salaries back to Great Britain when they retire. Yeah, I think the simple answer to that is, I mean, history is complex. It's much more complex than it's portrayed in history books, especially in school textbooks, right? I mean, I know in India there might be a great deal of emphasis on one or two figures, and those figures change over time, right, depending on who's in power. And the actual story, or at least what we're those of us who are historians think is much closer to the actual thing of what happened, is much more complex. There are numerous people whose contributions are kind of overlooked, and of course by even focusing on a Naoroji or a Gokhale or a Ranade, we're missing the hundreds and thousands of other people who played very significant roles but were completely and utterly forgotten today.
Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.
Namaste. I, Mithilesh and Sumit, welcome you all to a new episode of the Eastern Report. Today we have with us noted historian Shri Dinyar Patel on our show. Welcome, Dinyar.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Today we'll discuss Dinyar's book, Naoroji, Pioneer of Indian Nationalism. Mahatma Gandhi called Dadabhai Naoroji the father of nation, a title that today is reserved for Gandhi himself. Dinyar Patel examines the extraordinary life of this foundational figure in India's modern political history, a potent critic of British colonialism who served in parliament as the first ever Indian MP, forged ties with anti-imperialists around the world, and established self-rule or swaraj as India's objective. Naoroji is the first comprehensive study of the most significant Indian nationalist leader before Gandhi. Dinyar Patel is an assistant professor of South Asian history at SP Jain Institute of Management Research in Mumbai. Previously, he was assistant professor of history at University of South Carolina. He received Ph.D. in history from Harvard University. He has written for BBC News and New York Times, among other publications. So, Dinyar, what motivated you to pursue Dadabhai Naoroji's life and time and write the first ever comprehensive book on the subject?
Thank you very much. So you're asking about why I was interested to research and write on Naoroji. The answer is, that people like Naoroji, not much scholarship has been done on them recently. After the generation of people like Naoroji, Ranade, Gokhale, etc., once they passed, they kind of faded from memory for various reasons, right? I mean, first of all, of course, they were overshadowed by a later generation of nationalists who actually, delivered on the promise of independence, Gandhi, Nehru, and such. But also a lot of their ideas seemed a little antiquated, a lot of their viewpoints seemed a little out of date. And consequently, there hasn't been much stuff written about them. I mean, there is material, in the case of Ranade, there's not much primary material to work with, but in the case of Naoroji, there's a lot. So, there was a lot that one could possibly write on him. And the last really good, solid book in the form of a biography on Naoroji was published in 1939. So I figured, be a good time to reevaluate his life. And also, I thought, a figure like him is quite relevant for our, modern day sensibilities, in the sense that he was really an international character. I mean, he lived primarily in two different countries, both the UK and India. He was at home in both, spoke multiple languages, communicated with people all around the world, and was talking about economic inequalities. So there are lots of commonalities with a lot of the lifestyles that we have nowadays, and also the debates that we have nowadays about inequality. We're not as concerned today with political colonialism, but there are certain forms of informal colonialism, economic colonialism that economists and historians have talked about in our current day as well.
So, Dinyar, in your book, you obviously discuss about the life of Dadabhai Naoroji, but you also talk about the socio-political and economic realities of that time and how it shaped the life of the person we are talking about. Right? One of the anecdotes which you talk about is how Dadabhai Naoroji and his family had to move from Gujarat to Mumbai to pursue, looking for a better life. And this was more because of the exploitative economic policies which was pursued by the British, which had led to the decline of Gujarat as an economic power. So can you please talk about that?
Sure. Whenever you do research in the 19th century, I mean, the one thing that really strikes you first really, the first thing really, research about India, I should specify, is this background of impoverishment and also the specter of famine. It is really noticeable in pretty much everything you read. I mean, places like Bombay and Calcutta were prosperous, and Madras, and to a certain degree, other places like Delhi, Allahabad, and such, Hyderabad. But outside of these metropolitan centers, it was grim, really, really grim. So you had, of course, the collapse of a large part of the textile, the hand-woven textile industry, and on top of that, from really the 1850s onwards, you have these periodic mass famines happening every few years. Now, prior to 1850, there were famines. There were large famines, nowhere near as big as what happened post 1850. But chances are that one of these famines, which afflicted a part of Gujarat, prompted Naoroji's parents to migrate from the area around Dharampur and Navsari in Gujarat to Bombay. So you really see, in many ways, kind of an upturning of the economic geography of India, in the sense that places like Gujarat were once really rich, right, and were the economic engines of the country. And now, if you were in Surat in the mid 1800s, I mean, people were describing Surat as being a place with abandoned mansions. Population is decreasing. Bharuch was in severe decline. Khambat had been in decline for a long time. Towns like Navsari, which were once economically important, also had lost a lot of their economic importance. And the action is really happening in places like Bombay or Calcutta. But even over there, I mean, obviously there's mass poverty, right? I mean, if you went to what is today Azad Maidan, you would just see lots of tents of poor Indians from famine districts who just came and moved there. So it's a grim moment. I mean, we talk about poverty today in India. It's nothing in comparison to what it was like in the 19th century. It was really quite, striking just how bad things were.
Definitely. So there has been a lot of discussion, right? I mean, in research, in general discourse, people talk about how whether the British rule, did benefit or it actually impoverished India, and you discuss this at length in your book. Obviously, more in the context of the life of Dadabhai Naoroji. So, I mean, somewhere you have written that, I mean, there was a comparison done, right? I mean, how the people who lived under the British versus people who lived under the princely states, how they would absorb the price shocks, and hence the life of the people were better under the princely state. So, can you please talk about that and how Dadabhai Naoroji? I mean, essentially, you researched about that. What does it talk about it, and what were the real realities at that point of time?
Yeah, yeah. So the argument that Naoroji came up with, which a lot of other early Indian nationalists adopted as well, was that life in a princely state in India might be better for the average Indian than it was in British India. And the reason came down to what he called the drain of wealth, which was this idea that if you lived in directly administered territory by the British, due to taxation policies and the way that the administration was structured, a good chunk of revenue collected in a directly British controlled district was essentially funneled away back to Britain, right? So, within the total reserves of capital that you had, that would be, later on collected as taxes, a good portion of those taxes would go back to Britain, go out of the country. That was what he called the drain of wealth. And Naoroji theorized that this did not really happen to the same extent in the princely states. Why? Because their Indians were in charge. Indian officials were, manning a lot of the posts of the government, not entirely, of course, but most of them. And so, therefore, the taxes collected would more often than not cycle back into the local economy. And this obviously was not the case across the board in princely India, right? I mean, princely India was an extremely diverse collection of some 500 odd collections of states, some which were, no bigger than, a football field, and others which were as big as, European countries. So, I mean, you can't really classify all of them in one thing, but certainly some states, especially those in Gujarat and what we now call Saurashtra, were quite well off and were quite, relatively wealthy. And they had bureaucrats and maharajas in charge who were relatively progressive. And so Naoroji's idea was that, if you studied a place like Baroda or Gondal, you might find out that actually the actual state of the people was better off. That there was greater circulation of capital, therefore people were able to invest more. Quality of life would be better. Perhaps standards of education would be better. And Naoroji had a chance to kind of try out this idea and see whether it was true or not when he became Dewan of Baroda in the mid 1870s. And it's quite apparent, even though a lot of the records from his time as Dewan are lost, they're no longer surviving. But it's quite apparent that he received a bit of a mixed verification of his idea. I mean, he could do certain reforms relatively, with relative ease, since he was in a position of power. But at the same time, there was definitely quite a bit of poverty and misrule, even in a place like Baroda. And a lot of it had to do with the particular Maharaja who was in charge then, Malarao Gaikwad. But even after this experience, which was mixed, I mean, Naoroji eventually resigns and realizes that he can't really do much to help this particular Maharaja. He still champions princely states quite a bit. And, especially those enlightened rulers like Bhagwat Singhji in Gondal or Saiji Rao in Baroda, Malarao's successor. He really tries to champion their interests and craft many of them as, supporters of a lot of, not necessarily nationalist activity, but actively aligned with the nationalist industrial development, formation of political institutions, support eventually of stuff like Swadeshi.
I mean, obviously, and there is this guy, right? I mean, we are talking about, who was born in poverty. He then goes on to become, right? I mean, professor. He lives his life in UK. He becomes a member of parliament for Finsbury Central. Then he becomes a diwan for a princely state, and then he becomes this great person we should talk about. So how did this person come about? What led to the birth of this person? And because he was just a normal guy, right? I mean, how did he become this person?
He really acknowledged the role of free education, which again is something which is relevant for discussion of what's going on in India today, right? I mean, in the sense that like other Parsis or Gujaratis in Bombay, who had some means, I mean, who weren't absolutely poor, but, were a step above that, he was able to go to a Pathshala, right? A traditional school where he learned basic arithmetic and writing and such, but not much more than that, right? And these Pathshalas were very informal affairs. I mean, they would be conducted on the street or in a temple or, at the Mehta's house or something like that. So these were not very well developed institutions, but they did their job to a degree. But at a very young age, his Mehta actually encouraged Naoroji's mother, who's widowed by this time, to put Naoroji in a school that was being set up in Bombay, part of a network of free educational institutions in Bombay that was supported by the local government and taxpayers and wealthy Indians. So this was, again, one of the earliest attempts at comprehensive public education. in an Indian city. It was very limited in scope, obviously, right? I mean, in the sense that not everyone could avail of this because of limited opportunities, but it was free. So therefore, the poorest of the poor, if he, and it was at this point in time only he, the only men who could, or boys, I should say, rather, who could avail of this opportunity, if you were lucky enough to get this opportunity and be recommended for it, you got as good an education as you could probably get in India at this time. You were taught by British schoolmasters as well as educated Indian schoolmasters. You were instructed in English. So Naoroji went to a school where English was the medium of instruction. And this is, completely rare, right? In India in the 1830s. Now, of course, in a place like Bombay, not so much. But in the 1830s, this is probably, there are probably one or two other places in Bombay which are offering such education. So it really sets him apart. And in his mind, he also realizes with time that having got this opportunity for free education, being a relatively poor individual and nevertheless getting access to the best possible education you could get in Western India at the time, he owed society something. And I think that to a large degree explains a lot of his public spiritedness, in the sense that he realized that, the local taxpayer had given him this incredible opportunity, and therefore he owed something back to society in general, and therefore had a responsibility to be involved in political projects that benefited ordinary Indians.
I mean, obviously, we are talking about the point of free education, right? I mean, this remains true even today. I mean, the dream of everyone is that, even in the last 2 decades, millions and millions of Indians have somehow, right, left poverty and were able to get into middle class or even to the upper class, right? And here we have the person Dadabhai Naoroji. He actually did the same sometime 150 years ago or so. So, and here you are talking about free education. So what role did Elphinstine College played in that? And how did even such an institute exist at that point of time? Was it because of the magnanimity and educational policies of British, or it had some other reasons?
Yeah, that's a great question, because actually, when I started my PhD program, I think the question for anyone who does a PhD in Indian history is, what is British rule like, right? Is it more good than bad? Is it more bad than good? And especially when we think about education, it's a very relevant question, right? Because speaking in English, we went to institutions that were modeled on British institutions, whether they were colleges in India or elsewhere. And so it's a very legitimate question, right? Was the system of education that was put in place in India because of the, as you said, the magnanimity and the benevolence of the British. And I think the deeper you go into that, a lot of that idea kind of falls apart. Yes, there were definitely many Britons who came to India who, worked very hard, to promote Indian learning and knowledge. And some of those instructors were actually Naoroji's teachers, right? And, he actually talks about them quite a bit in his writings, that, so-and-so professor, like Professor Patton or Professor Green, and these were teachers at Elphinstone College, really, were dedicated towards the welfare of Indians. And that's definitely the case. We can't discount that. But the overall structure, when you look at the picture of what education was like in British India, is grim. And this is something which Naoroji will talk about later, in the sense that, yes, the British did establish a few educational institutions, but it was nowhere near enough, right? In the sense that, a few thousand lucky people got to get access to some measure of quality education, but, 200 million people did not. And that's a very important ratio to keep in mind, right? And in the sense that, in other colonies, there were attempts at better forms of education. If you go to the West Indies or even Ceylon or Sri Lanka, and in other parts of South Asia, that before colonization or Southeast Asia, there was a robust tradition of education. Maharashtra was one such place. Burma also had a pretty high level of literacy even before the British came in. But education is by and large systematically ignored by the British during the rule. There are a few elite institutions that are put in place, but these are drops in the bucket, quite frankly. It's good, but it's nowhere near enough. And Naoroji spends a lot of time in the 1880s kind of putting together statistics to understand just how bad educational opportunities were like in India. He showed that, look, if you're a young boy in Great Britain or America or even the West Indies, you had a pretty good chance of getting educated. If you are, a young boy in India, pretty terrible. And let's not even start about if you're a young girl. Your chances are next to nothing. So, it's as many things in British colonialism, it's very top down, right? In the sense that the top fragment of society got certain benefits, right? And that benefited the elite, elite Hindus, elite Muslims, elite Parsis, elite Christians, etc. But for the vast majority of the country, there's very little support. And when Naoroji and many of his other peers tried to promote popular education, say, in the rest of Bombay and the rest of Bombay presidency in general, so out in, what was called the Mufassal, right? Beyond Bombay or beyond the urban area, a lot of times the British were very reluctant to provide funding. In many ways, in many times, just turn them down.
I'd like to reveal this book to viewers. This book is pretty comprehensive on the grand old man of India. We all know about from our childhood, but we never in our courses. So I'll request everyone go and have a read. It's one of the best book written on historical biography in India. So this is the book, and I thank the author, Dinyar Patel, to coming up such a masterpiece with such a thorough research. So thank you for this. So we discussed the book and its wonderful writing. So let us discuss about the challenges that you face in this researching the life and time of the grand old man of India.
I think the biggest challenge at first is, again, the abundance of materials in the archive. I mean, when you write a biography of a historical figure, the biggest resource you'll need to work with is the private papers of that individual, right? So, I mean, before all of us, send emails, we of course would, in fact, before that, we all wrote things by hand, right? And if a person was important enough, that corpus of material would be preserved. So that is the case in Naoroji's case. I mean, there are private papers that are preserved that are mostly kept in New Delhi in the National Archives, but a lot was lost. Due to climatic conditions, deterioration of the papers, various wear and tear, lots of different factors. Whenever you evaluate a collection, there are obviously going to be lots of gaps, right? So it's a very uneven terrain that you work with. So, in working with the Naoroji papers, for example, he lived from 1825 to 1917. Well, in the archival material in the personal papers, there's hardly anything before 1886. There perhaps, there are a few hundred papers and before 1886. The corpus of material in the Naoroji papers is about 30,000 documents. So, how do you write something where you have, relatively few documents on the first X years of someone's life, the first substantial chunk of time of someone's life, and then just a plethora of material about the second half? How do you balance it out so that it's not uneven? So that proved to be a challenge. I had to track down a lot of material to supplement, material on the first half of his life in different archives and in India and Great Britain and libraries elsewhere, like the United States and Ireland. But ultimately, you can't write the same level of detail about someone if you don't have that primary material. So there's a lot of conjecture. To give you, a good example, I mean, we talked a little bit about the time that Naoroji was Diwan in Baroda. Well, in the Naoroji papers, there is a sheaf of papers from his time as Diwan. The only problem is I can't read it. It was written in Gujarati, and the document has deteriorated to such a great degree that it's basically a series of holes. So no one can really read it anymore. It is pretty much beyond use. So, you have material that perhaps 100 years ago could have been readable, but is no longer readable today. So what do you do? The answer is, again, you go to that other material that you collect, and you write with a lot of maybes, ifs, etc. You kind of conjecture. You make educated guesses. But it's really tough to do that. I mean, so, any attempt at biography is ultimately, it's an educated guess, right? It's the best, thing you can aim at. It's by far no means 100% accurate, right? But it's the best approximation can get at an individual's life and career.
So Dadabhai Naoroji was the first to propose a comprehensive plan for national education in India. How this struggle for education led him to a struggle with the British Empire?
Well, I'm not sure if he was the first, but he was definitely one of the first to publicly articulate the idea. I mean, others in India were talking about the need for education, but he was definitely one of the first to really call comprehensively for a program of national education at a popular level, right? Free education, and given his background in female education, also he was also very keen in promoting education for girls as well. He didn't want it just to be the province of boys. What was the second half of your question? So linking education with
yes. So initially he started with asking for universal education, right? Then he went on to amelioration of financial condition, and then he went on fighting against the British Empire that we need swaraj. So how did this transition happen? Like, how come from education to this? So what led him to go beyond that?
Yeah. So Naoroji began his career in Bombay in the late 1840s and 1850s, and a lot of his work was, as you said, with promotion of education, specifically female education in Bombay city. So he wasn't as yet talking about a comprehensive national plan for education. That comes much later, 1880s or so. But certainly, the biggest thing he was probably known for in this era, the 1850s, when he was in his late 20s, early 30s, is promoting female education in Bombay. And that probably opens up to him some perspectives on areas of deprivation in that colonialism caused, right? The lacuna in what colonialism provided. I mean, public education was one of them, and the fact that there were just so many poor people streaming into Bombay, some of them who eventually probably ended up in schools that he attended or eventually helped run. That also helped to open his eyes to things like poverty. But I think, again, the scale of poverty in this era was so vast, you couldn't help avoid noticing it. And I think it really strikes him the first time he leaves India and goes to Europe. So in 1855, he leaves his professorial position at Elphinstone College in Bombay, and he travels outward through the Middle East, onwards to Europe, to eventually settle in London and Liverpool. And he wrote some Gujarati language documents that were published in Gujarati articles that were published in Rasgufta, a newspaper that described what he saw and what he observed. And he talks about places like Egypt or Aden being somewhat similar to India, in the sense that there's a lot of poverty. There are some attempts at modernization in places like Egypt, building of railways. But once he gets to a place like France and then Great Britain, it's shock and awe, quite frankly, just how prosperous these places are. I mean, you can just tell from what he's writing that he is amazed and bowled over, quite frankly, by how advanced and how prosperous these places are. The average farmer was well off. There was access to technology. You went to a place like London and Paris. These were modern cities, and it made a place like Bombay, which was relatively advanced by Indian standards, pale in comparison. So things like that really help him, I think, understand just how poor India was.
Sure. So obviously, I mean, Dadabhai Naoroji was a professor, so you'd expect him to write books, right? It's not a surprise that he's writing books. That's what his job is. One part of his job is. But he has gone beyond that. It's not that he has just written books. He actually wrote one of the most fundamental books, which established that how drain of wealth was happening from India to the UK, right? I mean, and he really did an extensive research on that. So could you please talk about that?
Yeah. So the book you're talking about, Poverty and Un-British Rule, that was published in 1901, and it's a thick book, right? It's not a breezy read. It's hundreds of pages long, and it's a compilation of his life's work. It contains papers, very long papers that he wrote, really from the 1860s onward on the topic of poverty and the drain of wealth. Along with speeches and other documents that he produced during his political career. So it's really kind of the culmination of his life's work. It's not a book that he sat down and wrote in one go. It was something that was kind of bringing together all of the different various writing projects that he had throughout his life. And most of these took place between the 1860s and the 1880s. And you see in this book kind of a progression of this idea of the drain of wealth. I mean, it started off with the idea that, British rule was good for India, but there are these problems, right? I mean, so in the 1860s, he talks about British rule being mostly good, but there are these problems. There's poverty, and this drain of wealth is something that needs to be avoided. And he actually, says in an early stage, 1860s and 1870s, some of the drain is legitimate. We need to pay the British for the benefits they're giving him. But what's striking is that, over time, his opinions change, right? I mean, no one's opinions stay constant throughout one's life. And in the case of someone like Naoroji, they advanced in a much more progressive vein at a pretty rapid clip. So by the late 1870s, he's far less enthusiastic about British rule. He's talking much more about the problems of poverty, famines, and the idea of the drain of wealth that he's developed is much more robust. He's talking now about anywhere as up to 25% of the revenue of British India being siphoned away through one mechanism or another, and he importantly links the drain to the need for political change. The drain of wealth is being caused because British people are running the country, and we're paying for their salaries, and they are taking their salaries back to Great Britain when they retire or whatever. And his argument is that if we employed Indians, first of all, they'd be much more receptive to our concerns, and secondly, their salaries would be spent in the country, and the wealth would be cycled back through the country. So you see a very specific line of thought developing chronologically from the 1860s through the 1880s, to the point that by 1885, 1884 or so, he calls British rule evil, and he calls for something like self-rule, self-government for India. The idea is vaguely developed at this point, but it's there, and it's very early on, right? I mean, this is before Tilak is on the political stage. This is before pretty much any Indian of major political standing is talking about anything approaching something like swaraj.
Absolutely. Also, I mean, there is a discussion in India, right? I mean, post-independence, that the pros and cons of British rule. One of that, which is generally counted among the pros, is railways.
Yeah.
Hey, I mean, British gave us railways, as if we couldn't have gotten it without being them. So, but I mean, in your book, you talk about how there were different princely states, they introduced railways by themselves. I think that is an information which many people don't know. Even I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah.
Could you please talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, the railway debate is very long, and there are dozens of articles on it. And I'll just say, for the sake of fairness, there are some academics who have said, and have provided economic evidence that the railways did actually provide a great deal of economic benefit. There are those who say that the railways, accelerated the drain of wealth because they allowed the British to kind of penetrate the hinterland of India and, deplete the wealth further, whether that wealth was in the form of finances or cotton or jute or what have you. But there are others, I was in a conference about a month ago where, a statistical attempt was made at evaluating levels of poverty in districts in India based on how long their connections with railway systems went back. And the conclusion this particular professor made was that, the longer there's been a presence of the railway in a district in India, the more wealthy that particular district is. Now, I mean, there are a whole bunch of confounding variables that could explain that also, but there are two sides to this debate. But Naoroji came down quite strongly on the side that railways were not actually going to benefit India. They actually, in many ways, accelerated the drain of wealth. And he and others made an important point, which you allude to, which is, it's not, railways could have happened in India without British intervention. I mean, the railway was not a British monopoly. There were other countries around the world building railways at this time. So you didn't need colonialism to develop a railway network. I mean, it helped in the sense that, there were major British railway financiers who poured their money into building these systems. Of course, they were compensated to a very high degree by the government of India. But the princes are a good example. They build railways too, and if you go to places like Baroda, you'll see evidence of this. The gauge is smaller. And you go to other places also, like I think Patiala had experimented with a monorail. I mean, so there are lots of cool examples of princely state experimentation with railway systems, and that's a great example, which shows you that you don't have to wait for colonialists to give you this modern infrastructure. You can do it yourself. And princely states could develop modern infrastructure by themselves, and in some cases do it better. And develop a network that embraced modernity without colonialism. That was really what a lot of people like Saiji Rao were, at least in his early decades, were aiming at.
Why and how Dadabhai Naoroji turned towards Westminster?
So obviously it's a good question. Why would an Indian want to want to stand for the British Parliament in this era? And the reason I've given in my book is that, look, in the era of early Indian nationalism, there just were not many opportunities for you to achieve concrete political reform in India. The government was just too conservative. Your resources as early Indian nationalists, again, if you're a Ranade or Gokhale or Firoz Shah Mehta or even a Tilak, and of course a Naoroji, were very slim, right? I mean, you had very limited financial resources at your disposal. The power of the press was somewhat limited. I mean, it was, there were influential newspapers in India. And Naoroji had a hand in running his own, as did others like Tilak, of course. But it's a mostly illiterate society, and the reach of such publications were limited. What do you do? Well, given all these obstacles, given the poverty of India, perhaps the best opportunity for achieving some sort of concrete change was actually by going to the very fountainhead of power, the very top of the system called colonialism, and that was the British Parliament. Ultimately, the British Parliament had the power to legislate on India. Its power was circumscribed, but it was there. It was ultimately, the British Indian government was ultimately beholden to Parliament, and Parliament could legislate on certain aspects of the Indian budget and such. So why don't you go into the British Parliament and try to be a voice for reform there? It was a tactic that was attempted by many other Indians as well as other colonial subjects. Other colonies like Canada or Australia tried to get their own parliamentarians in. Not necessarily Australians. They would pay British MPs to kind of be the advocate in Parliament for them. So why don't Indians try this as well? Now, ultimately, in Naoroji's case, it's very much a mixed bag. I mean, he enters Parliament, obviously, in 1892, and he becomes known as Member for India. I mean, in terms of advocating for India's cause. But it's an entirely different question of whether or not the rest of your fellow MPs will listen to you. Because, again, they are not responsible to Indian voters, right? No one is, right? No Indian is voting for a member of Parliament. MPs are interested in India out of their own goodwill, but there was no threat of being kicked out of office at the ballot box. So ultimately, Naoroji's ability to influence Parliament was quite limited, as he discovered. And after he loses election in 1895, there's definitely a moment where he's quite a bitter man. He realizes the limitations of the strategy.
So how did obviously you talk about how when he was trying to get elected from UK, he had to raise money, and he raised the funds for his election campaign from different princely states. So how did this guy develop all this political capital that he could go to princely states and ask for money?
Yeah. So when Naoroji is campaigning for Parliament, I mean, it's an expensive process, right? To run a campaign. I mean, it is today, and it was back in that era also. And the cards were even more stacked against them, because the way that the exchange rate worked was that as much as, say, 20% of the value of an Indian rupee would be shaved off whenever you transferred that rupee to Great Britain and converted it into a British pound. So it's really difficult, right, to raise funds. You can, the people who wanted to contribute might be Indians, but those Indians have the disadvantage of this, this exchange system working. So when Naoroji, campaigned for funds to support his electoral campaign, he needed to go to rich people to fund him. And those rich people were, by and large, the Maharajas, right? So people like Saiji Rao or Bhagwat Singh Ji in Gondal, or other people, like the ruler of Bhavnagar and other states in places like Kutch. These were people who he contacted. In terms of how he got to know these people and how he transmitted these funds, to a large degree, we do not know. Probably because a lot of this correspondence was deliberately destroyed, or just it was done in conversation rather than written down. Because a lot of these rulers did not want British authorities to know that they were funding, an Indian candidate to be elected to parliament, because it was a deeply controversial, moment in history. And if you're a princely ruler, you are ultimately, you are semi-autonomous, but ultimately, if the British want to, they could make your life quite miserable, right? So if they know that you are contributing money to, a candidate who's speaking out against the British Empire, they might take punitive steps against you. So when you read the little surviving correspondence that talks about these financial exchanges, it's written in a very cryptic fashion. Write to B, and he will send you 50. What does that mean? Right? And eventually you come to the conclusion that B probably means Bhagwat Singh Ji, and 50 means probably 50,000 rupees. And so, what, an individual in India is instructing Naoroji to do is write to Bhagwat Singh Ji in Gondal. Bhagwat Singh Ji will give you 50,000. And, when you need more, write again. And, things like that's the small window we have into how this dynamic worked out. But by and large, a lot of it is just lost to history. We just don't know how that process worked.
One of the reasons, reading your book, it comes out that at that point of time, Dadabhai Naoroji was one of the intellectual, right? He went to Eliphenstine College, he became a professor, then he went to UK, tried his hands at entrepreneurship. So he's a guy who is deeply intellectual and right, managing companies and doing entrepreneurship. So obviously, he got a Diwan offer for Diwanship at Baroda. So would you say that just because there was a dearth of such people like Dadabhai Naoroji at that point of time, unlike what India is today, he got to develop this relationship with all these Maharajas and princely states?
That's part of it. There was obviously a limited pool of Western educated Indians, right, at this time. But there was still a number, right? There were a few hundred, few thousand by the 1870s who had been educated at institutes like Elphinstone across India, who had some level of relatively okay education. But Naoroji was probably one of the most senior. So the reason why he is eventually appointed as Diwan, or at least given the offer by Malharao Gaikwad, is because there's a longer history of Naoroji's ties with people like Malharao Gaikwad, as well as the princely states. In the 1860s and 1870s, Naoroji was probably visiting many of these individuals and talking to them and talking about princely state affairs, and so he's kind of a natural fit. But there are other people also. People like Dinkar Rao, or other people coming out of Hyderabad. There are there's this kind of educated cadre of Indian administrators, and this grows in size through the 1890s and 1900s. Eventually you get people like R.C. Dutt, who also becomes Diwan, and Aurobindo serve in a capacity also in Baroda. So the pool grows, but it's Naoroji was unique in the sense that he was probably the most senior of those people. And when he went to Baroda, he brought many of those educated colleagues along with him. So in many ways, the cabinet, so to speak, that he brings to Baroda is to a large degree a product of Elphinstone College also, right? It's his classmates, or people who were students, or people who had since gone through Elphinstone and received a similar education to what he received.
During his time as a Diwan at Baroda, it's very evident that the situation of the Maharaja of Baroda is very precarious. He is somehow a fish out of water, because he has to manage relationships between corrupt English officers and Dadabhai Naoroji, who plans to bring it more fiscal consolidation into the state. So this shows a deterioration of the really bad situation of the Maharajas that late into the late 1800s. I mean, would you talk about that?
Yeah, it's, again, princely India was mixed, right? Depending on where you went. I mean, certain states developed a relatively sophisticated machinery administrative machinery by the beginning of the 20th century. States like Travancore or Baroda, again, Gondal. Others had relatively progressive rulers, and others did not, right? Others were quite backward. So, again, if you look in the correspondence of, Naoroji and others, you see this playing out. I mean, people like Behramji Malbari talks about a state like Khambat, and Khambat had apparently a very backward, ruler, and the administrative structure was not very good. At the same time, there were people who were doing pretty fantastic things in other states, across India. So it really was mixed. I mean, you can't assign one particular, mode or level of progress to princely India in general. It was as diverse as the states that the whole system of princely India encompassed. But corruption was a huge problem, right? I mean, across the board. I mean, not just British officers, but those who are working for the princely government as well, the Indians who are working in the princely administration itself. And I think this really is something that kind of clicks with Naoroji when he joins as Diwan in the mid 1870s. He realizes that, well, the problem is much deeper than just British versus Indian administration. It's the type of Indian administration as well. And if you have a princely state system in place, ultimately, if you still have a ruling monarch who has so much arbitrary power, there's going to be lots of opportunity for abuse of power, or power being used for nepotism or being abused by your relatives. And that certainly was the case in Baroda. I mean, even though Baroda was much wealthier and much more progressive and better off than many other states in India at the time, it still had some pretty negative drawbacks to it, right? I mean, there were some pretty horrific stories coming out of the administrative practice of a state like Baroda in the 1870s under Mahla Rao. I mean, pretty bad things were reported. So there were systemic problems as well, which of course later nationalists pick up on, and that become kind of the dominant narrative. But at this era, I think there were early nationalists thought that things could go either way, right? I mean, you could continue this progressive tendency amongst a few princely states and kind of develop something where in a state like Mysore, you eventually have a legislative assembly by the 1880s and kind of develop something maybe like constitutional monarchy. Or things could go, in the case of a Khambat or even a Hyderabad, of being relatively autocratic.
Dadabhai Naoroji life and time motivated the revolutionaries and freedom fighter of that time. Even Gandhi termed him a father of nation at that point of time. So how he motivated the generation of his time?
Perspectives on his career and life changed dramatically over time, right? I mean, so in the sense that up until about the year 1900 or so, he's probably considered, not just the most prominent Indian nationalist, but definitely one of the most extreme, right? The most forward of Indian nationalist voices. And this tends to diminish between 1900 and, say, 1906, when he comes back to serve as president of the Congress in Calcutta, in the sense that you get a new crop of leaders who are much more willing to challenge British rule and are fired by ideas like Swadeshi. And of course, we know, Tilak, Bipin Chandra Pal, others like Shyamji Krishna Varma, Lala Lajpat Rai. These people all come to the fore in that narrow window of time. So already by the end of his career, his reputation as a more advanced radical leader, it's diminishing. And that reputation certainly goes downhill from that point onward, because a lot of the ideas that he is championing, quickly, the ground changes in Indian nationalism. And, ideas that were considered beyond possible 5 or 10 years ago now seem very possible. Swaraj, or, a comprehensive system of boycott to, promote the idea of Swadeshi. That was relatively unthinkable in the 1890s, right? I mean, people were talking about it, certainly. But by 1905, 1906, it's there. And, so the Swadeshi movement was talking about many other things: national education, the need for strikes. These were things which, again, people were talking about for a long time, but now it all seemed possible. So the ground changed at a relatively rapid pace from this point onward. So much so that by the time of the 1920s or so, people like Naoroji were at the stage of being relatively forgotten. Now, the most prescient nationalist leaders realized that there was still value in what he brought, right? In the sense that people like Gandhi and Nehru said, well, look, Naoroji was really the first person, one of the first people to talk about the economic drain of wealth and introduce the idea of swaraj and link the drain of wealth to swaraj. This in itself is important, but some of his methods are now outdated. And that's a completely legitimate analysis to make. A lot of the less charitable later nationalists by the 20s and 30s are dismissing Naoroji as being, almost like maybe not a fifth columnist, but, someone who was very tame and almost cowardly and, definitely not a revolutionary, right? And I at least have problems with that analysis because obviously, you can't take today's political scenario and apply it to something 30 or 40 years beforehand, right? I mean, the situation was very different. What was possible was very different, and tactics changed depending on what your abilities and resources are like. And that's why I think someone like Gandhi, talks about this dynamic that Naoroji had an ability to change with time, and perhaps if he were alive in 1930, he would have been extremely old. If he were alive at that point in time, maybe he would have recognized that something like what he was practicing, non-cooperation would have been the way to go. Maybe not. But Gandhi said that at least was possible.
Coming towards the radicalization part of Dadabhai Naoroji life, from Westminster to asking for home rule and swaraj. So how this transition happened? What led all this changes in his approach towards the empire?
Yeah. Again, I think if you look at the years 1895 to 1905, 1906, it is like a catalyst has happened in India. A catalyst has taken place in accelerating the pace of change and even the radicalism of Indian nationalism in general. Many things happen, right? Widespread famine, plague. The government that's in power in Great Britain now is conservative and very hardline on Indian nationalism. Eventually, you have, Curzon coming to power as viceroy and causing a lot of disaffection through his various policies, most notably through the division, the partition of Bengal. So stuff really changes dramatically in this 10-year period. And it's changing for Naoroji as well. So again, by 1895, he's lost election to parliament. He's become, relatively bitter, not, entirely bitter, but he realizes that much more needs to be done than just, petitioning and pleading in parliament. And for him, the answer to that, what do I do extra, is reaching out to people abroad and, reaching out to, say, socialists in Great Britain. Or in Europe, or reaching out to anti-colonialists in America, and cobbling a greater interest in India and the need for Indian reform and eventually swaraj. And by 1903, 1904, he's publicly calling for swaraj for India. I mean, he had in private talked about swaraj again as early as 1884. But now he says it's the time to make this public. We need to really have a sustained popular movement. Now, what that popular movement was doing was, again, different from what it eventually would do under Gandhi. I mean, these were not people who would go out on the street and embrace lathi blows of policemen. Instead, what Naoroji had in mind were people who would, draft petitions, hold meetings, agitate through meetings, maybe in some cases employ boycott and strike to a certain small degree, definitely support Swadeshi through purchasing Swadeshi goods, but it would be measured, okay? And it took, someone like a Tilak or Lala Lajpat Rai or others to go a step further and say, no, we need something much more than this, borderline militant or militant in the cases of someone like Aurobindo. So, he was part of that process of radicalization and a very important part, but, I don't want to equate Naoroji to a Tilak, not at all. I mean, the two are quite different. But, certainly Naoroji was a bridge between someone like a Tilak and others like, say, a Gokhale or Firoz Shah Mehta. And certainly the longer that Naoroji was talking about the need for radical change, the closer he approached someone like Tilak as opposed to someone like Gokhale. I mean, in his last 1 or 2 years of public life, 1905, 1906, he's actively telling Gokhale, he's literally putting the word swaraj in Gokhale's mouth, saying, you need to get behind this idea. Your colleague Tilak is more correct than say your more moderate nationalists, in advocating something like a comprehensive program of swaraj.
So Dadabhai Naoroji was obviously one of the founders of Congress, but how did it change? How did Congress change between the time? I mean, since it was founded by him, and at the end of, let's say, middle of 1910.
It's it was really an up and down transformation, in the sense that I think during its early years, 1885 onward, there was a lot of growth. Certainly, if you look at the writings of Allen, Octavian Hume, you notice that there's a great degree of work that's being put in place into building up a concrete infrastructure in India. To the extent of opening Congress offices in small towns, even having Congress chapters in villages, getting villagers to vote in Congress elections. So not just urban elites, but people, not the poorest of the poor, definitely not, but people in between, to get involved in the Congress organization. But there were always limitations. There were financial limitations. There were limitations in the ability of Indians to have the time and the resources to work in this organization, and that ultimately hobbled the organization to the extent that by the early 1900s there were people talking about how the Congress was becoming increasingly maybe not moribund, but it was not a dynamic institution. It needed a kick here and there to kind of propel it back into action and development. And it was really difficult to do this because the Congress was an organization that was not just based in India. It was also based in Great Britain. A large percentage of its activities took place in London, trying to convince parliamentarians to support a reformist program or running newspapers that kind of reached out to British voters to try to convince them to vote for people who would support Indian reform. And finance became a huge problem. So you'd see that people like Naoroji and Dutt and W.C. Banerjee and Allen Octavian Hume and William Wedderburn increasingly fund the Congress out of their own pockets. They actually go to their savings and give money to support this organization. And a lot of them, have precarious financial existences because of devoting so much money towards these organizations. So, it really changed in terms of, the year based on what financial resources were like. I mean, by the early 1900s, India had also gone through a series of devastating famines. What is the likelihood of finance being used to support the Congress versus famine relief, right? Or even just putting food out on plates for your own family members. I mean, even for someone like Gokhale, that was a pressing issue. I mean, Gokhale's family was affected by the plague. Do you spend money on your nationalist objectives, or do you spend money trying to save your relatives and getting treatment for the plague?
In India, right, in history books, whenever we go and about the freedom fighters, we mostly end up with few names that you count on finger. And we hardly learn or hardly read about Dadabhai Naoroji. So what suggestion you would like to give, given that government has asked for suggestion? So what would be your suggestion for that?
Yeah, I think the simple answer to that is, I mean, history is complex. It's much more complex than it's portrayed in history books, especially in school textbooks, right? I mean, I know in India there might be a great deal of emphasis on one or two figures, and those figures change over time, right, depending on who's in power. And the actual story, or at least what we're those of us who are historians think is much closer to the actual thing of what happened, is much more complex. There are numerous people whose contributions are kind of overlooked, and of course, by even focusing on a Naoroji or a Gokhale or a Ranade, we're missing the hundreds and thousands of other people who played very significant roles, but who are completely and utterly forgotten today, right? And in my book, I try to talk about a few of these people, right? I mean, and my next book will talk about a few more of them. I mean, journalists and political leaders, no one knows about today, right? But these people played an important role in their own aspects. So it's not just about one or two leaders, right? It's about a cohesive effort, and certainly, some individuals were taller than others, but under every individual were dozens of others who were in a supporting role. And Gandhi said this very eloquently in Hind Swaraj. We are able to get. He kind of envisioned Indian nationalism as a staircase, right? We are able to get to the position that we are because previous generations had built the first few steps, and now it's our job to build the next few steps. And it's incorrect to only talk about Indian nationalism in regard to. I know this is not a very good analogy. The last step, which might have been a Gandhi or Nehru. You have to get the whole process and the whole dynamic in place to understand really how things worked. And that means talking about people who are less studied, like Naoroji, and people who are completely unstudied as well.
Can you please tell us what are you currently working on?
Yeah. So first of all, thanks, Sumit and Mithilesh, for having me here. It was great talking to you. What I'm currently working on, a number of things. I'm working on a few journal articles. I had one journal article that came out recently that looked at Indian nationalist activity in the United States during World War II. Another journal article that is in the process looks at the history of management education in India before things like the IIMs. Currently, I'm writing a paper on Parsi activity in Iran in the 19th and 20th century. Another project is on the history of the idea of Swadeshi, and the next book I'm writing, and it's kind of it's in pause mode right now, since I've had a few other things I'm working on, is looking at early Indian nationalism in general. So again, looking at those other people I talked about who have received less attention, and thinking about ideas like how India related to the rest of the world and how global precedents informed Indian nationalism in the years before Gandhi.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, a lot of questions, but yeah, I mean, I think we are over. So yeah, I mean, it was great having you here, and thanks for discussing with us about your book. And yeah, we wish you best for your future work and your life. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hopefully you liked this episode. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.